I am Rebecca from ChemKnits. Today we're going to dye yarn 5 different ways using the exact same amount of dye in each of the projects. The exact same recipe technically, but the technique that we're going to use for each of these projects is going to vary either significantly or maybe just slightly to show off how some subtle differences to your technique and how you're applying that color to the yarn can make a difference in the final product. When I originally designed this video, I had 4 colorways in mind, 2 of them being tonal and 2 of them being dip dyed. For the 2 tonals, on one of them, we're going to combine our pink and yellow dyes and get a semi-solid tonal colorway. For the second tonal, I'm going to layer the colors onto the yarn one at a time, creating more of this layered tonal effect that I've done a number of times in the past. And now for our 2 variations of our dip dyed colorways. In one of them, I'm going to add the yarn into a dye pot. I'm going to dip it in and sort of let it be stationary and absorb that color. And we'll do that into the 2 different colors that we'll have mixed. For the other dip dyed colorway, I'm going to dip dye the way I more often do it, with continuous motion. So that way we have a little bit more of a blending and overlap of the colors. And I just thought that it would be fun to side by side show what all these different colorways look like. And then for our 5th colorway, I decided to do something a little bit more random and less planned, but we'll talk more about that a little later on in the video. As you've probably gathered from my sketches, today we're going to be playing with a pink and a yellow. Specifically, we're going to use Dharma Acid Dye's Deep Magenta and Brilliant Yellow. Before we jump into those dyeing projects, I need to give you a little message from our sponsor. This portion of the video is sponsored by Alana Wilcox's Color Alchemy Masterclass. This is a course that goes beyond just dyeing yarn. It'll teach you to truly understand color. If you've ever felt stuck when trying to mix a color or frustrated when your results don't match the color you had in mind, this course is going to help you take control and understand your colors. Early registration for the Summer 2025 course is now open. The class will kick off with a live orientation, followed by on-demand lessons that will help you build a strong foundation in the science of color and art of dyeing. After that, there will be 4 live Zoom sessions that'll take you through starting from an inspiration photo to pull colors to create a color palette, creating precise color formulas with confidence, ways to organize your notes so that way you can actually replicate the results that you had another time, and ways to troubleshoot the process so yarn dyeing feels exciting and not stressful. Throughout the course, you'll get direct support from Alana on a private Discord community, plus exclusive access to the course's textbook, Color Alchemy From Digital to Dye, that is only available to Masterclass students. And the book comes as part of the course kit that Alana puts together for you. One of the things that sets this course apart is that it's not about a particular brand of dye, but understanding color in a broader sense. Alana will teach you how color works, so that way you can apply this understanding and techniques to whatever brand or tools you're using in your projects. Whether you're a hobby dyer or an indie dyer building a business, this course will help you feel more consistent, confident, and creative. I have not taken the Color Alchemy Masterclass myself, but I have collaborated with Alana on some of her digital dye recipes with fantastic success, and I did take her digital dye notebook workshop so that way I could review that. And I also found that to be a really well put together workshop. And in fact, if you're not ready to jump into the masterclass and want to see if Alana's teaching style aligns with your learning style, you can take the on-demand workshop, How to Create a Digital Dye Notebook. And then if you decide to join the masterclass later on, you can apply the fee from the on-demand digital notebook class to your masterclass enrollment. Registration for the summer session closes on June 13th, 2025, and spots are limited. You can find more information, reviews, and beautiful student dye results at alanawilcox.com. I'll have that linked down below in the video description. Alana, thank you so much for sponsoring this portion of today's video. And now let's go play with color. I put on my Let's Rubber respirator masks, safety glasses, and gloves so we could start making some 1% stock solutions of our deep magenta dye and brilliant yellow. I measured out 3 grams of the pink dye, 4 grams of the yellow dye, and then transferred the dyes into some warmed glass jars so I could dissolve the water with some boiling water in my dedicated kettle that's only used for dyeing, never used for food. Everything here is only used for dyeing yarn, never used for food. Now, in theory, I could have weighed out the dye directly into these glass jars, but I wanted to warm them up a little bit so they wouldn't get a shock and crack when I poured in the hot water. And since they're wet on the inside, this means that if I over measured out the dye powder, I wouldn't be able to correct it well. The total volume in each jar at this point is under 300 milliliters. So we weren't at a 1% stock solution yet. I wanted to let the liquid cool off a little bit so I could add it into one of my plastic measuring containers so I could bring the final volume up to either 300 milliliters for our pink or 400 milliliters for our yellow. I am preparing a lot more dye than I need for this project because I have another project where I need some of the pink that I'm going to be doing later today or tomorrow, and sometimes I want my dye stocks measured fresh, sometimes I don't need it measured fresh. Once I'd finished each dye stock, it was time to measure out our dyes so that way we would have the dyes ready to go for our 4 to 5 different projects, and we would have the exact same amount of dye in each one. And the nice thing here is that if there was a measuring error at any point, because I'm measuring the same volume now with the liquid dye stock all at the same time, we know there's the same amount of dye in each of these cups. But anyway, I measured out 60 milliliters of the yellow dye and separated that into the little containers. And I did 30 milliliters of our pink dye. And I set up 5. Maybe we'll do 5 colorways, maybe we'll do 4, but I'm excited to dye some yarn. And now we have 5 sets where we have 60 milliliters of our yellow, or 0.6 grams of dye in each cup. And of the pink, we have 0.3 grams of dye, or 30 milliliters of our 1% stock solution in each of the cups. Let's start off with our 2 dip dyed colorways, where we will be dipping a portion of our yarn into a color, letting that color absorb, and then moving to dip the yarn into another color. But in this first example, when I dip the yarn into the dye bath, I'm not gonna move it, so we're not gonna have a lot of blend of the color throughout the skein. In this pot, I have 16 cups of cold water and no acid, and I'm gonna come in with one of our samples of pink. Now, deep magenta can bind super fast. So for this particular type of dip dyed colorway, where I want to dip a section of the yarn and leave it in versus doing something more smooth, I would like to add some of the yarn in here without acid so we get good coverage. We are going to add approximately 2/3 of the yarn into the dye bath and move that around. Okay. We may be a little under 2/3 or a little over. That is fine. But I'm going to go ahead and let this sit as is for like a minute or two, just because I know that this pink is a color that can bind so fast. And so giving it just a little bit of time to sit in there, maybe some of it will start binding even with things really cold. We will see, and I'll see you in just a couple of minutes. I am going to lift the yarn up and add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar in and sort of stir it up with the yarn. Raise and lower, doing the acid slowly. Now, ideally, if I really cared, I should still wait a minute or two before adding more. But I'm going to go ahead and add 2 more tablespoons now. Once again, stirring it up a little bit with the yarn. There will be some tonal variation in this section, but again, because things are cold, things are gonna be way more consistent over this area than they might have been if I had set this up hot. And so now I'm gonna take this over to the stove. I'll have another container over here in case we have some capillary effect and have some liquid moving over. But I'm gonna heat this until it warms up and the color has absorbed onto our yarn. So I'll probably set a timer for 30 minutes, but if I notice the water is clear sooner, then we'll come back a little sooner. And we may need to go ahead and reset the dye bath before we do the yellow, but we'll see. You know how I mentioned having a pan under here? Look at all this water that has come through. That's the capillary effect. I just dumped that liquid back in so that way we didn't lose too much water volume. But it was in here over 30 minutes just because of the way that my setup has been going today. But you can see that we have no color left in that dye bath, which the heat's been off for a little bit, so that is cooling. And then there is some softness of where these colors are this time, but overall, the pink is very consistent. We don't have a gradient. So I'm gonna move the zip ties down to the pink end. I'm gonna do this here as well. Move it down, and I'm gonna try to make sure that the white sections are even with each other. So that way we layer similar amounts. Both are looking quite even. So now we can do our dip into the yellow. Brilliant Yellow also strikes to yarn pretty quickly, similar to the pink, but we're using the same dye bath that has higher acid than what we started with for the pink. And we're gonna rinse this cup out so we can get the rest of that dye. Give everything a good stir. And I've sort of marked on the yarn for myself how much I want to add. And the reason for raising and lowering is just to get the yarn well distributed through that point. I'm gonna bring our pan over to collect water. And again, I'm gonna raise, lower, and then set that aside. And I'm gonna turn the heat back on at this point, and I'll set a timer for 30 minutes so we can slowly heat things up. And since we got 30 minutes on that pink side already, I am not gonna feel the need to steam set this necessarily, but we'll see if I decide to remove it sooner, but I think we should be okay. You can very clearly see this time that we're gonna have yellow, orange, and then our pink in a beautiful variegated colorway. But the transitions, while there's gonna be a little bit of blend and softness to it, it's going to be there's gonna be more of a transition versus a gradual transition from the dip dyed colorway when we continuously moved it. So anyway, I'm gonna set this aside until the timer goes off. It has been 30 minutes and I am going to remove our yarn. I can't wait to compare these to each other once everything is dry, but we've got this beautiful, very clearly pink, orange, and yellow colorway. And I did empty water once, but there's a little more is the yarn. And you can see that, you know, we have more abrupt color transitions this time on this particular dip dyed skein. Our second colorway is also a dip dyed colorway, but this time I'm going to move the yarn a lot after adding it into the pink and then the yellow. This is gonna blend those colors together a lot more than what we saw in the last colorway. This time we have a hot dye bath. You can see I've got a hot plate or a trivet here to hold onto, which should be helpful. And we started with 24 cups of water, but I'm gonna only add 3 tablespoons of white vinegar and our pink dye. And that's because I know that this pink color can bind really quickly. Now I am gonna rinse the cup out in the sink because if I were to add it to this hot water, it definitely would melt. Stir that up. And now I'm gonna go get our yarn and we're gonna dip dye into this. And we'll see how quickly things go. And so unlike the other one, this time I am continuously moving the yarn. I am raising and lowering it so that way we get more color at one end and then less color as we go up, which you can already see happening. Now we may end up adding all of the yarn in, we may not, but we're doing a lot of movement. And then each time we go in, we add just a little bit more. So now I'm actually gonna pause. I know our yarn is in the dye bath, but I need to get a little more acid. That brief pause should not result in any kind of demarcation line because it's with our deepest area. And I can say we are starting to clear because if I go in, you can see we are getting definitely lighter and lighter. But what I'm gonna do now is add more acid. 1, 2, 3. So that way we can hopefully absorb all of the color. And you can see in these lightest sections that there are some areas that are a little bit more white, a little bit less pink. And look how little color is left in our dye bath now. Almost all of that color is in the yarn. When I add in this yarn here, I'll leave this last little bit out. When I add the yarn in, there is only the littlest amount of pink. And so starting with acid can help things bind pretty quickly, but it can also, by starting with lower acid and then increasing it in the middle of the dip dyeing process, can really help you get the coverage. But even here, you can see we've got some light areas. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna set it aside, not with more heat. I mean, that's pretty much clear. Actually, I changed my mind. I am gonna remove this yarn from the dye bath. Look at this pretty gradient that we have here. And I'm gonna set this yarn aside to cool for just a little bit, so that way it's comfortable. I mean, it shouldn't take too long, comfortable to handle, but I can also then heat the pot up to reset. And then we will eventually move the zip tie down to the other end to dip dye into the yellow. This water is still nice and hot. I am gonna quickly just wipe down the end. Ultimately, it is okay if there's a little bit of pink left. If there is, it's really not much of anything. I'm just gonna take this over also while we let our yarn cool to go ahead and heat this up again so we're nice and hot for our yellow round. While I'm waiting for the pot to heat up again, I moved the zip ties down to the darkest pink end to get ready for the next dip dye. All right, we are nice and hot again. Let's add our yellow dye and we're gonna go rinse this out. Okay, now in my experience, yellows can strike pretty quickly, but I think the pink strikes a bit faster. So I'm gonna try to keep an eye on things and we're gonna be doing this a lot by feel. Here we go. And the one thing that we can't do this time is I suppose I could, but since I'm using the exact same dye bath, I can't reduce the amount of acid that I have in here in the same way that I did before. Now, with yellows, it's a little harder to see how things clear. So you may notice that I'm going a little bit faster, at least at the beginning, because I want there to be some amount of yellow that goes most of the way up. But then, you know, we have a little bit going up to there, but we're focusing mostly on that white edge. And we may hit a point where either I decide to add all of the yarn into the dye bath, probably not. I think what's more likely is that at some point I'm gonna leave it with a portion of it in. Now, the yarn has not heat set for 30 minutes, and is that a big deal? Maybe, maybe not. I will probably go ahead and steam set this yarn for 30 minutes in the end, so that way we will have had access to heat for 30 minutes. It just makes me comfortable because there have been some times with some colors that don't strike quite as fast, and that makes me feel better. But another thing you could do is, since it's cleared, I could add everything in here into the dye pot and heat for 30 minutes. But the reason why I don't want to do that, and the reason why I'm going to steam instead, is on the off chance some acid dyes will bleed in hot water. We've seen that before. And I like this colorway that we have the way it is right now, with our pink to yellow progression here. And so by adding it to a steamer basket, I can add it in a way that hopefully would avoid any transfer from the pink end to the yellow end. And I can go ahead and steam set this for 30 minutes instead of just heating it for 30 minutes. And so that's what I'm gonna do right here. And we may do something similar with the other colorway eventually, even though I know I'm not showing things in chronological order, I'm showing each project together. And now that we are done steaming, I'm gonna set this yarn aside to cool completely so we can wash it. I'm not gonna wash all the yarn on camera though, but I am gonna hang on to the steamer basket just in case. Colorway 3 is our layered tonal. And for this colorway, we're gonna be applying all of the dye all over the yarn, but we're gonna do this one at a time with first the pink and then the yellow. For our layered tonal colorway, I am reusing the dye bath that we used for our continuous dip dyeing. So the proportion of acid to water is 2 tablespoons of white vinegar to 8 cups of water, and we started with 24 cups of water. And so that volume is probably reduced here. I started by adding our pink dye. I rinsed out the cup and then brought over the 200 grams of yarn, added that into the pot, and let things sit until almost all of the pink dye had absorbed. And given that this water is warm, this is gonna happen really quickly. I'm not trying to dip dye. I lifted and lowered the yarn just to move it through, but you can see that the color is not consistent everywhere. We have a lot of tonal variation in there. I set the pink yarn aside, brought over our yellow dye. I didn't bother heating up the dye bath in between again because everything is still quite warm. Rinsed out the cup, stirred things up, and then added the pink yarn back into the dye bath to get our yellow layer. Once again, moving it around a lot so that way we can try to get as good coverage on the yarn as possible, but acknowledging that there are going to be some spots that'll be a little more pink, some a little more yellow, just because of the way these dyes are. After adding the yellow, I brought this back over to the stove where I let everything heat for 30 minutes, and then I removed the yarn from the dye bath and set it aside to cool. Colorway 4, normally I would just call a tonal, but for the purposes of this video, I'm calling it a combined tonal because we're gonna mix our pink and yellow dyes together before applying them all over the yarn. This is more of your classic tonal semi-solid colorway. For our quote combined tonal yarn, I started with a fresh dye bath of 16 cups of cool water and then added in our yellow and pink dye at the same time, rinsed out the cups and stirred everything up. I then added the yarn and stirred it around. The reason why we're starting with no acid and cold is so I can get more coverage of both of the colors on the yarn. It is possible, because the pink seems to bind a little faster than the yellow, that we could see some color breaking with this combination if I were to start hot, which also would be something fun to do sometime, but I'll leave that one for another day. I let the yarn sit in with the dye a little bit before removing the yarn to add 4 tablespoons of white vinegar and mixing everything back up. After adding the yarn, I brought everything to the stove, heated up for 30 minutes, and then removed the yarn and set it aside to wash off camera. I had to add just one more colorway. There are so many different things we could do with the same amount of dye on yarn, just varying the technique a little bit. But since we're doing everything in my dye pot today, let's do some space dyeing and apply the dyes to the yarn with the yarn in the pot first. This final space dyed colorway is one that originally I wasn't planning on doing, but I thought would be fun because it's just another type of colorway that's a little bit more random that we can dye using this same amount of dye. Using the dye bath the same dye bath I used as the layer Tonal, I added our 200 grams of yarn in there, a little bit twisted, but not with too much twist, in a circular way. Then I went and I filled our dyes up with some water just to have the volume be a little bit bigger, and then poured that dye onto the yarn, where I'm gonna let things sit for at least 5 minutes before maybe moving things around, or maybe we'll just let it sit the whole time. I did film a 10-minute time lapse to see how much these dyes would spread out, but they really didn't spread that much overall. I mean, they were spread when I first added them, but after that, things stayed put pretty well, which is consistent with these colors striking to the yarn pretty quickly. After 30 minutes on the heat, I removed our space dyed yarn and set it aside to cool, so then we could start washing some of our completely cooled off yarn. I'm planning on washing most of the yarn off camera, but let's go ahead and take our 2 dip dyed colorways and wash them here. Haha, they are very different, but very similar. Just a little bit of difference in motion can make. Now, oh, I thought I saw some color, and I was gonna say, aw, man. We should be okay, but in this particular colorway, our pink and yellow, and as I add some blue dish soap, in this particular colorway, the pink is more saturated at one end and the yellow is more saturated at one end, whereas most of the other colorways, the colors are more evenly distributed on the yarn. Well, let's go ahead and fill this up. All right. And look, our zip tie's got, oh, because I dip dyed. I was like, the zip tie's got almost no color on it. That's because the end with the zip ties was never in the water. But we have no bleeding here. And if this colorway doesn't bleed, then the other 3 colorways also shouldn't bleed. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish rinsing out the soap. Then I'm gonna put all the yarn in my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll take a look at our finished colorways. Here are the 5 different colorways we created today. Each of them was created using an immersion technique in a dye pot, and each of them used the exact same amount of dye. And yet, we have 5 really distinct different colorways. We'll go through the different comparisons in a moment, but when you're talking about a dye recipe and how much dye you used, you need to consider how much of the yarn you're using that dye on, because technically the recipe for each of these was the same. It's just whether we dip dyed, added everything at once, layered the colors, that's where things differed to give us the different results. We dip dyed yarn in 2 different ways. One of them, I continuously moved the skein to give us a more blend of the colors. And because we had mostly yellow here, mostly pink here, and the blend in the middle, I would say this one feels predominantly pink and yellow with some hints of orange. But then when we dipped 2/3 of the skein in at a time, we have something that, surprisingly, this yellow feels brighter. This pink doesn't feel quite as bright as what we have over there. But we have a more defined orange spot, and you can really see it the most at the change between the yellow and the orange. You know, where we have just a really soft transition between the colors. And there is still a softness down there. It's a little bit of a blend, but it is much less of like a gradient transition and more of just a color change. The same can be said for this pink end, but because the contrast between the orange and pink isn't as great as the orange and yellow, it's a little bit more subtle overall. The differences between what I would refer to as our layered tonal versus our more combined tonal are very, very subtle. But in this layered tonal, there are areas that are more yellow, some areas that are a little bit more pink, and then we have those orange tones in there. Whereas the yarn, where we combined the colors, there are some hints of variation in there, but things are more consistent throughout the skein. It is much more of a true solid, or really a tonal of a single color versus the layer of the 2. This type of comparison is one I've done multiple times before because really it's just that subtle tweak in the technique. And sure, when I didn't want the colors to break to kind of make these examples stronger, I started cold with no acid to really get those colors all over. So there were some differences to the techniques between the two besides just adding the color all at once or doing it in layers. But I imagine, and maybe we'll need to revisit this, that even if I started cold with no acid for both layers, our layered tonal would still have some of that tonal variation to it. It just might be a little more subtle. Let me know in the comments if I should try that out. Finally, we have our space dyed yarn. And what makes this colorway the most unique of everything is that we have some white left behind, which we really don't on our other skeins. Now, one of them, this one has a lot less orange. This one has a little bit more orange, but otherwise there are a lot of similarities between them. But space dyeing like this, when I don't know exactly how the colors are gonna blend and spread, is one of the techniques where I say, hey, you probably want to alternate skeins if you're going to knit with both of them every couple of rounds because there are definitely differences between the two. Now, if you want more control over the color placement, you could do your immersion dyeing in a rectangular catering steam pan where you can have more control over the placement of the colors. But part of my goal with this one was to not have as much control over the placement since our other 4 colorways were very controlled. And just to show something else that, again, has the exact same amount of dye as everything else. It's just cool to see how completely different it is from that semi-solid tonal that we now have in the middle. So our semi-solid here is probably what we had for 200 grams of yarn, 0.9 grams of dye. So we have a 0.45% depth of shade here. But how does this compare with the orange that we might see on our dip dyed yarns? With the skein on top, where I dyed about 2/3 of the skein in all of the pink and turned 2/3 of the skein in all of the yellow, we have an orange here that is deeper, it is more saturated than the tonal I'm showing below it. We could probably try to estimate the depth of shade that we would have here. I guess that half of all of the dye is on that middle third of the skein because we dyed 2/3 of it in one of the colors, 2/3 in the other, and so that third in the middle was there all the time. And so that's more dye per yarn in that limited area. And I'm not going to go through and try to calculate the math there for you right now, but it's just interesting and but it could be worth doing the math. If you wanted to dye up a variegated colorway like this, and then have a tonal here that matches this color. And if that's something you would like me to do, please let me know. I can do that in another video because I think that there's something very interesting there. Because, you know, these are not quite the same color, they're close, they're not quite the same dye lot, all those things. And so, yeah, that's something that we could play around with more in the future. Now, as for our other dip dyed skein, there's a lot less orange here. I would say our tonal matches a little bit closer, but also because as we went down, we decreased the amount of yellow, we increased the amount of pink, we are more likely to hit a tone that is here. And so I would say these two skeins work together a little better than these two, even though everything that I dyed in this video all works together really well. Side note, check out the glazing that we have there. Oh, so pretty. Here are the 10 skeins, but for simplicity, I'm gonna narrow it down to 5 because I thought it would be worth chatting about which of these you could use in the same project and what might work really well together. So I think 3 skeins, and I would probably do something like that. These could work together for some kind of fun fade where the colors get more and more blended as you go through. And partly the reason why I think that is that there's a randomness to these two that lends well to each other. These two skeins are much more repeating. And so while you could do something like this, where you go from random with white to more repeating, then you'll go to something more random again. But I think that that is the way that I would order those. This particular skein, I think would work really well. So this is our dip and hold versus continuous dip dye. This was our continuous dip dye. I think this would work well with the layered tonal because there's a lot of those tones that work well in there together. And so I would pair those together for a project. And I think that that could work really nicely. It's funny because twisted up, it's harder to tell the difference between those two, where it's a lot easier to tell when they were untwisted. There are so many other ways that we could do something like this using the exact same amount of dye on yarn. And actually, one idea that just occurred to me is what if we brought in an element of measuring out the exact same amount of dry dye to use in powder form as we had in liquid form, and to do some comparisons there. If that's a video you would like to see, please let me know down in the comments. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and the last thing worth noting is that all of this yarn is superwash. So if you were going to be doing these side-by-side comparisons on non-superwash yarn, where the colors strike a little bit slower, some of the differences, specifically between the tonal and layered tonal, may be even more subtle than what we have here. But you can always play around with the rates the colors absorb by deciding when and where to add heat and acid to your yarn. I want to give another thank you to our sponsor today, Alana Wilcox, and her Color Alchemy Masterclass. You can find more details about this amazing dyeing course at her website, which is down in the video description. And so I know I dyed 5 different colorways in this video, but sometimes it can be hard to stop at just 5. I gave some other ideas that I had earlier. It's fun to do comparisons with little tweaks of the technique. And sometimes I do those within one video, sometimes they're separate, where maybe I'll focus on one little variable. So if you want more comparisons, please let me know down in the comments below, and feel free to give suggestions of colors and techniques you'd like to see me dye up side by side. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. This is the biggest way you can help support all of the content here. Thank you so much for watching.